Hey everyone, we're going to talk about race and ethnicity today in chapter 12. This will be the last chapter that we cover formally, and probably going to shorten the notes a little bit down in terms of slides, but we'll get into much more. So if you haven't taken down the title card, take it down now. Let's move on. So sociologists around the can't really agree on the number of races around the world. Some sociologists really believe there's two races. Some sociologists believe there are a large number that more aligns with maybe the social definition. So that makes race kind of tricky from a sociological perspective, how to study it and what it is. So in most cases, sociology really studies ethnic groups versus race. Now, some of the key things with race, there is no racial superiority. There is no racial purity. No race is better than another in terms of any of those factors like intelligence or et cetera, et cetera. So if these ideas permeate through a society, then that can lead to genocide, something we'll talk about more as we go through the chapter. And I'll hit on that example. So ethnic groups are a little more broadly defined by cultural characteristics, right? So race is about these physical characteristics, but people really differ. So ethnic groups are more about culture, and that makes more sense, right? So example would be Jewish ethnic group, or Jews would be an ethnic group. Now, there are some Jews that feel like being Jewish is a race. Sociologists wouldn't categorize it as that. Doesn't mean they're wrong, that people believe that are wrong. But just from our perspective for this course, and they be considered an ethnic group. So that's really where we really hammer down what we'll study. And race and ethnicity are interchanged a lot. I'm sure we'll interchange them a little bit. In this chapter, we talk about things that will apply to either or, but in a lot of cases, we'll talk about race from the socially constructed perspective, and ethnic groups from maybe more of the definitive perspective. So minority groups exist. Generally, if you have an ethnic group that's been in a place together, they are in a place together. So minority groups often exist when an area has a changing political boundary or migration to a new place. Beginning of America, for example, Native American tribes, were not a minority group, right? There were different ethnic groups within Native Americans, and depending on their migration, sometimes came to conflict. But really, it was the migration of Europeans to what now is the United States of America that made Native Americans a minority group that were discriminated against. So this can happen, or if we look at changing political boundaries in Africa during the scramble for Africa of European countries, that led to groups being paired together, and one group is going to take power over another. Let's move on to the next slide. So prejudice is kind of learned, right? We talk about prejudice and discrimination a lot. Prejudice is learned from society, from leaders, from people's parents, from people's families. Prejudice is not an innate born idea that because someone looks different or is of a different race or ethnic group, that they are inferior. There's been a lot of studies done, on children and in different social environments and how that applies. So people can even learn to be prejudiced against their own group, that certain features of their own group are is fine. So that's something that we'll get into as well. There was a study of from Black researchers, Black interviewers interviewing Black subjects about kind of their preferences of beauty. They a lot of Black men trended towards lighter skinned Black women. That this idea of some of these socially constructed things like beauty, etc., can have a prejudice built in. And so we see discrimination occur in the United States and other parts of the world in many different areas and facets: home mortgages, are often denied to minority groups. Here in America, that's happened to people of color, healthcare and the access to healthcare, politics, etc. We'll get more into that. So if you go on the extreme, prejudice and discrimination can occur via political leaders, and that leads to genocide of a race or ethnic group, like the Holocaust, like genocide in Rwanda, like the genocide in Turkey. There's many different examples. We will probably venture into some of those and how that happens or how some of the different perspectives would view that. So let's go on to the next slide. We'll kind of hit on these different perspectives. So the theories of prejudice, from psychology, really goes into the scapegoat theory, which lines up a little bit with functionalism, that if you have authoritarian personalities, they want to hold power, and so they'll scapegoat any problems off on a different group. And so, I use the Holocaust as example for many of these, because it's probably the, example that you're most familiar with. Most of you I taught last year, at the very least, about the Holocaust. So from a psychological perspective, it says, hey, the Nazis scapegoated the Jews to avoid any type of questioning of their authority. Functionalism is that prejudice is kind of a function of a social environment, that by being prejudiced against a race or ethnic group, that you are saying that you win and that ethnic group loses, that you feel better about yourself when you can put other people down. And that often is a function of that social environment. When you combine this with areas of an economic environment, something like African slavery, then it becomes very tough to break. So basically it is like, hey, by putting this group, saying that they are worse than the minority group is worse than the majority group, it's kind of bringing down that social function. Conflict theory, it's Karl Marx theory, that prejudice keeps those powerless without power. The goal of prejudice is to hold down minority groups, hold down people that are kind of working class, that make up the most of the population, so that they can't rise up and fight for better wages, fight for the better human rights conditions, things like that. And that the goal is to get people that don't have power to also turn. So those in power that kind of know what they're doing, it's conflict theory again. No, if they can turn other workers against and be prejudiced against races and ethnic groups within their own ranks, that they can splinter those ranks and there won't be any collaboration. So this is often cited today, even in prejudice in America, right? That if kind of rural whites are racist against Hispanic immigrants, that in turn their lack of power won't matter as much, right? There's someone below them, and that's what they want. And then symbolic interactionism is that labels create prejudice. That there's this, that there are, as we label people, things, right? These stereotypes exist. We've talked about that before, and because the stereotypes exist, that kind of creates the prejudice, and that people have these self-fulfilling stereotypes that feel like they need to play into the stereotypes, or that those stereotypes are true in given circumstances. Something we'll get into in this chapter. Let's go to the last slide here. So in the United States, the American culture was created by what are called WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the first settlers in America that have made up the majority, or even have not made up the majority in more recent years, but still hold a lot of the power. So their goal is to assimilate other cultures, Native Americans, African slaves, Spanish, Latino, Hispanic people, et cetera, into quote-unquote American culture. And so we see, African Americans, Hispanics, later Asian Americans, Native Americans, other groups, do form a diverse range of ethnic groups in the United States. And we're going to talk about each of these in some detail, what that looks like, what are the issues today, what are the issues in the past, and how that plays into society. So, and the races past the United States, we talk about African slavery, we talk about Native American genocide, we talk about Japanese internment, we talk about things like the Zoot Suit riots or some of the limiting immigration policy on Hispanics. Has left a legacy that of inequality and discrimination and prejudice that exists, and how we kind of deal with that and address that is important. So that's something we'll get into in this. So once again, a fairly heavy topic, and I appreciate the adult, nature and mature attitude of students here to discuss some of these issues. So I think this will be good, and I will talk to you soon. Thank you.